Hey, 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 it's story time with Miss J. Hey, 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 it's story time with Miss J. I'm excited to read this book with you. Let's click the button and get started.
Hey everybody, I'm so excited to read this book with you. It is called Frederick Douglass, The Lion Who Wrote History. It's written by Walter Dean Myers and illustrated by Floyd Cooper. Let's get started. Frederick Douglass, The Lion Who Wrote History by Walter Dean Myers, illustrated by Floyd Cooper. This is the story of how one man's careful decisions and many accomplishments not only made his own life better, but in many ways changed the history of America. Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey was born a slave in Talbot County, Maryland in 1818. His grandmother, Betsy Bailey, was also a slave, and she took care of young Frederick. When Frederick was about 9, he was sent to live with the slave owner Hugh Auld and his family. He was given chores to do around the house and help care for the family's children. Soon after he arrived, Frederick saw Sophia Auld, the mistress of the house, teaching her children to read. He wanted to learn too. Seeing how eager he was, Mrs. Auld started giving him lessons along with her own children. But when Hugh Auld found out that his wife was teaching Frederick to read, he objected. "Teaching a slave to read will make him unfit to be a slave," Mr. Auld said. Sophia was not happy, but she understood what her husband meant. The ability to read would expose slaves to ideas and information that would make them unhappy being owned by others. Frederick also understood what Mr. Auld was saying. He thought hard about how the slave owner linked reading with slavery. There's Mrs. Auld reading to Frederick and one of her sons. Frederick listened carefully to the Auld children. They spoke clearly and directly, and he knew it was because they also read the words they used. He felt that reading could make a difference in how a person lived. As he grew up in the Auld household, Frederick was becoming aware of what it meant to be a slave. Slaves were forced to work for their owners. As punishment, they could be beaten, and they could be sold away from their families. Frederick watched as the Auld children received an education. He listened as they excitedly shared their ideas and dreams with friends. Theirs sounded like a good life, and he wanted the same chance to build a good life for himself. There's Frederick thinking about the great life he's gonna build. If learning to read would make him unfit to be a slave, then that's what Frederick would do. He made the courageous decision to learn to read. It would be very difficult because slaves were not allowed to go to school or have books or practice reading. When he could, though, he borrowed books from the young white friends he sometimes played with on the street. He picked up old newspapers and flyers he found on the streets. Anything that contained precious words was very important to Frederick. Here he is reading one of those special newspapers. By the time he was 16, Frederick was tall, well-built, and very unhappy with his life. He was also a reader and a young man who used words well. Sometimes he used them unwisely. After he argued with his master, he was sent to Edward Covey. He was a man known for making slaves less likely to stand up for themselves. He would bully the black men and women and beat them until they gave up the struggle to be more than slaves. Frederick was beaten viciously every week when he was with Covey. But one day, the slave breaker tried to beat him again and again, and guess what? Frederick decided to fight back. This was a brave decision because he could be killed for that. The two men struggled furiously for more than half an hour. In the end, It was Covey who gave up against the now very strong Frederick. Covey never tried to beat Frederick again. There he is, strong and determined to stand up for himself. Frederick was hired out to the shipyards. He became a caulker, a hard job that took strong hands and careful attention as he put tar and heavy cord between the boards of ships to make them waterproof. Most of the money he earned went to his master. But for the first time, Frederick was meeting free black people. Many of them sailed the very ships he was repairing. Wow, look at him working so hard. Free black sailors had always been a problem for slaveholders. They had papers proving they were free, and they were able to rock around most ports as they chose. The tales of their adventures spread among the enslaved black people. Frederick listened to them carefully and imagined himself being free like they were. During the time of enslavement, not all black people were enslaved. Some of them were free. When he was 19, Frederick fell in love with a free black woman named Anna Murray. But he was a slave, and he could not be with her as he chose. The lure of freedom became almost unthinkable, but to try to escape was a risky business. Slaveholders didn't want to lose their precious property. They were often punished severely. Frederick knew, though, he had to take that chance. He wanted to be with Anna Murray. Look, they're so in love. In September 1838, Frederick made his move. Using the seaman's papers of a free black sailor and dressing like the sailors he saw on the job, he boarded a train headed north. "I suppose you have your free papers?" the conductor asked him. "No, sir. I never carry my free papers to sea with me," Frederick said. "Here are my seaman papers." The conductor looked at the papers. He looked at Frederick. "You don't sound like you're from around here," he said. "I haven't been around here much," Frederick said, holding his breath. The conductor gave Frederick a hard look, then accepted his fare. "I don't think you'd like it very much in these parts," he said. After the train ride, Frederick took a ferry across the Susquehanna River into Pennsylvania, and then he took another train to New York City. Frederick arrived at the home of an abolitionist whose name he had been given. "Sir, I can use some help." Frederick was trembling as he spoke to the man. Come in," said the man. "You've come to the right place." Frederick entered the house and let out a deep sigh. He had escaped. He dressed like a sailor, boarded a train, and made his way north. That took a lot of bravery. Anna Murray soon joined him in New York. They lived there and they got married there. After a short while, they made their way to New Bedford, Massachusetts. In 1838, New Bedford was a city with a small but strong black population. It was nicknamed the Whaling City because there was always whaleboats in the harbor. And Frederick was sure that he could find a job. Frederick loaded and unloaded ships, sawed wood, hauled coal, anything to make a living. Afraid that slave catchers might be looking for him, Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey decided to rename himself. He was now Frederick Douglass. This is when he becomes Frederick Douglass after he is free. He doesn't want to get caught. He doesn't want people to know who he is. He was very impressed by the people in New Bedford. All of them were hardworking sailors or dock workers, and many of them were abolitionists who spoke passionately about the rights of all people. Abolitionists are people who don't believe in slavery. They want to abolish it. Abolish means end. Can you say abolish? Abolish and abolitionist. In turn, abolitionists were impressed by Douglass. Here was a man that could really tell what it was like to be a slave. He had been forced to work for his white masters. He had been beaten. His sisters had been sold away from the family. Not only could he tell of his experience, but he could speak with eloquence, and his eloquence stirred the souls of his audience. Douglass was often asked by abolitionists to speak at their meetings. Some people who heard him could hardly believe he had been a slave. They wonder if all black people working in the fields or on southern plantations had the potential of this strong, handsome young man. Douglass was also asked to write the story of his life. In 1845, when he was only 27 years old, he wrote his autobiography. It was called Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, and it was published. Frederick Douglass understood how speaking helped him bring people into the fight to end slavery and to get equality for all human beings. In 1848, at a convention for women's rights held in Seneca Falls, New York, his powerful speech convinced the male delegates to pass an important amendment demanding that women be allowed to vote. I have never yet been able to find one consideration, one argument or suggestion in favor of a man's right to participate in civil government which did not equally apply to women. Frederick Douglass spent years speaking for the rights of black people and women. During those years, the differences between the agricultural South, with its cotton, rice, and other crops, and the more industrial North, which is large cities and factories, became more distinct. This is Frederick speaking up for women's rights and speaking up for the rights of black people. He believed that all people should have all of their rights. What do you think? In 1859, Douglass was contacted by John Brown, a militant white abolitionist. John Brown was passionate about freedom. He had heard the language of other abolitionists and saw that for the most part, slaveholders paid no attention to them at all. These men are all talk, he said. What we need is real action. In Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, Brown shared his plan with Frederick Douglass. It was risky, but to John Brown, it was more plausible than the do-nothing plans of other abolitionists. If Frederick Douglass would be part of the plan, it would have a greater chance of working. I wonder what his plan is. Frederick looks skeptical. Here is a chance to put the question to everyone that has ever had a slave, and to this country, Brown said to Douglass when they met. Douglass thought hard and carefully. Brown's plan was to capture the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, then take the weapons into the hills. To me, you're entering a perfect steel trap, Frederick said, and one from which you will not likely get out alive. Shortly after their meeting, John Brown led a raid on the arsenal at Harper's Ferry. It happened on October 16, 1859. The raiders succeeded in capturing part of the grounds at Harper's Ferry, and they took a number of hostages. But in the end, the raid failed, just as Frederick Douglass thought it would. This is John Brown, and this is Frederick Douglass when they were meeting about the raid in Harper's Ferry. You can visit Harper's Ferry, especially if you're in the DC area. It's only about an hour away. They have great historical reenactments, and you can really see where John Brown led this raid. The conflict between the North and the South was coming to a head. In December 1860, the Southern states began to secede from the nation. They decided to form their own country, the Confederate States of America. President Abraham Lincoln ordered the American forces called the Union Army to put down what he considered a simple rebellion and treason. The battles between the North and the South went on for 3 long and bloody years, without either side gaining an advantage. The Union Army was made up of white soldiers with some black people used as laborers. Douglass urged the Union to enlist black soldiers. In 1863, shortly after the Battle of Gettysburg, he met with President Lincoln and urged the president to enlist black soldiers as equals in the Union Army. I saw in the war the end of slavery, Douglass declared. I urged every man of color who could to enlist, to get an eagle on his button, a musket on his shoulder, and the star-spangled banner over his head. The iron gate of our prison stands half open. One gallant rush from the north will fling it wide open. while 4 millions of our brothers and sisters shall march into liberty. 180,000 black soldiers, many of whom had been born enslaved, joined the Union Army. They helped to defeat the Confederacy in 1865. In 1865, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution was enacted, and slavery was legally abolished in the United States. Remember that abolish means end. In 1865, slavery was legally ended in the United States. The careful and wise decisions made by Frederick Douglass to learn to read, to escape from slavery, to speak out for justice for all Americans, and to aid the Union Army has helped America write history. Frederick Douglass was born enslaved. He continued to work and speak up for the rights of all Americans. He served the United States government in Washington, D.C., as well as in Haiti as a consul general. His voice, born in the soft tones of the slave population, truly became a lion's roar. That's why he is the lion who wrote history. The end. I hope especially that if you're in the DC area that you take some time to go visit Frederick Douglass' house. Right now in the time of coronavirus, you can only walk the grounds, but there are a lot of grounds to cover, and I hope that you see where he was in Washington, D.C. when he changed history. Be sure to celebrate his birthday. It is February 14th, and I hope you have a great Black History Month.